At 3:12 a.m. on July 9, 1944, the night over Saipan had already begun to thin, though the darkness had not yet surrendered to dawn. The air carried the weight of burnt cane and cordite, a bitterness that clung to the lungs and refused to clear. Private James Holton of Lubbock County, Texas, sat with his back against a shallow coral embankment overlooking a narrow saddle of ground that sloped toward the remnants of what had once been a Japanese defensive line. His helmet rested beside him. His rifle lay across his lap. In his hand, folded once and then again, was a sheet of thin military stationery he had just finished writing on under the shielded glow of a flashlight cupped between his knees. The paper trembled slightly, not from fear, not yet, but from fatigue. He had been awake for nearly 30 hours. The letter was brief. He told his mother that the ocean here was bluer than the Gulf she had once taken him to see as a boy. He told her that the heat reminded him of late August cotton fields. He did not tell her that the island smelled like something already half dead. He did not tell her that Japanese forces had been compressing into the northern ridges for days, preparing for something desperate. Instead, he wrote, "If this is the last one for a while, just know I did what I could." The phrasing was deliberate. Holton was 21. He understood the weight of words sent across oceans. Around him, Company K had dug shallow positions along a ridge overlooking a corridor of brush and broken limestone. Intelligence reports had suggested a large concentration of Japanese troops still unaccounted for. The Marines and Army units pushing north had encountered sporadic resistance, but something about the silence in the last hour had unsettled the seasoned sergeants. Too quiet, too orderly, the kind of stillness that preceded a surge. Holton folded the letter and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He would give it to Corporal Vance at first light for mailing with the next supply rotation. That had been the plan. Plans were fragile things on Saipan. At 3:47 a.m., the first sound came. Not gunfire, not shouted commands, but a low, rhythmic murmur rolling up the valley like distant surf. It grew in volume, resolved into voices, into something almost ritualistic. Banzai. The word had already become synonymous with the final convulsions of Japanese defensive doctrine. American units had learned that when it came in mass. Hundreds, sometimes thousands. A last charge intended not to survive but to overwhelm. Holton rose slowly, bringing his M1 Garand into position. The men along the ridge exchanged brief glances, the kind that required no speech. Flares began to climb into the sky, casting the valley in harsh white arcs that exposed movement where moments earlier there had been only shadow. And there they were, lines of figures emerging from brush and broken ground, rifles raised, bayonets glinting, officers driving them forward with drawn swords. Later estimates would suggest nearly 300 Japanese soldiers in that sector alone, part of what would become the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. But at that moment, the number was less important than the velocity. They were coming fast. Machine guns opened from the flanks. Mortars thudded from positions further south. The ridge shook as the first wave collided with American lines. Holton fired methodically, 8 rounds, ejecting the clip with the metallic ping that had become both comfort and curse. Reload. Fire again. Men to his left were shouting. To his right, a position collapsed under sheer force, defenders dragged down in the surge. The line bent, then fractured. Communication disintegrated into isolated pockets of resistance. A sergeant screamed for fallback positions, but the sound vanished in the roar. Holton found himself no longer part of a coordinated line but an outcropping of resistance between 2 overrun sections. He shifted to a secondary depression in the coral, dragged a light machine gun toward him from a fallen crewman, and continued firing into the advancing mass. The first wave fell in rows. The second stepped over them. The charge did not slow. It absorbed casualties and advanced regardless. Holton's world narrowed to sight picture and recoil. His shoulder bruised beneath the stock. Ammunition boxes emptied beside him. He felt something tear across his left sleeve but did not register pain. Japanese soldiers were now within 20 yards. 15. 10. The night had fully broken into a flickering inferno of muzzle flashes and flares, illuminating faces contorted not with fear, but with fatal commitment. Somewhere behind him, an American officer attempted to re-establish a defensive perimeter, but the momentum of the charge had severed cohesion. Holton was alone in the depression, the last anchored position in that stretch of ridge. He did not know how many had fallen around him. He knew only that if the saddle behind him was breached, the engineers and wounded further downslope would be exposed. His letter pressed against his chest as he shifted position again, braced the machine gun, and prepared to hold ground that had already been statistically lost. The first Japanese soldier reached the lip of the coral embankment and fell forward under Holton's burst. The second stumbled over him. The third cleared the body and lunged. Holton dropped the machine gun and drew his sidearm. The charge did not pause. It was enveloped, and in that tightening radius of steel and smoke, Private James Holton from Texas began the stand that would later be reduced in official summaries to a handful of lines. But in that moment it was measured only in seconds, breath, and the refusal to step back. The third man cleared the embankment and came at him with a bayonet held high. Not shouting now, not ritualistic, just mechanical in his motion. Holton fired once, twice, and the soldier collapsed forward, the weight of him sliding down the coral slope until he stopped against Holton's boots. There was no time to move the body. More were climbing. The machine gun lay where he had dropped it, its barrel already smoking. He grabbed it again and fired from the hip at near-contact distance, the recoil driving the stock hard into his ribs. The muzzle flashes illuminated faces only feet away. Young, mud-streaked, eyes wide not with hesitation but with an urgency that bordered on hysteria. The Banzai charge had lost its formation by then. It had dissolved into individual surges, each man sprinting forward as if outrunning his own death. Holton pivoted left and right in a tight arc, cutting down those who reached the lip of the depression. The ammunition belt thinned rapidly. He felt the weapon sputter, then jam. Sand and debris had worked into the feed during the scramble. He cursed, flipped it aside, and rolled to retrieve his Garand again. Another wave was cresting the slope. He fired until the clip ejected, reloaded without looking, the motion ingrained through repetition at stateside ranges that had never simulated this kind of proximity. The Japanese soldiers were now within arm's reach. One leapt into the depression, colliding with him, and they went down together in a tangle of gear and limbs. The rifle fell away. Holton's helmet was knocked loose. The man's hands were at his throat, fingers digging into skin slick with sweat and coral dust. Holton twisted, drove his knee upward, felt cartilage give. He reached blindly for his combat knife and brought it forward in a single brutal thrust. The man sagged. Holton shoved him aside and scrambled upright, lungs burning, ears ringing from continuous fire around him. The ridge above had become a silhouette of chaos. American figures retreating in sections, others holding in pockets, flares still arching overhead and casting everything in stark, colorless glare. He could no longer see a cohesive line. He could no longer hear ordered commands. What he could see were the shapes still advancing through the valley, stepping over their fallen, closing the distance to the saddle behind him where engineers and wounded personnel had established a makeshift aid station. That was the hinge point. If the Japanese broke through that narrow corridor, they would collapse the entire rear section before reinforcements could pivot north. Holton knew it instinctively. He also knew he was the only fixed obstacle left in that gap. He moved higher up the depression, deliberately exposing himself to draw focus. He fired again, slow, deliberate shots now, conserving ammunition, aiming center mass at those attempting to coordinate another push. Several Japanese officers, identifiable by swords raised above their heads, attempted to rally men into a tighter formation. Holton targeted them first. One fell backward mid-stride. Another spun and dropped his weapon as a round struck his shoulder. The surge faltered momentarily, but momentum was a living thing that night. It reformed almost immediately. A grenade landed to his right, rolled against coral, detonated with a concussive blast that threw shards into his forearm. He felt the heat before he felt the pain. Blood began to seep through torn fabric. He ignored it. He shifted position again, dragging an abandoned ammunition crate closer. He could hear shouting behind him now, American voices attempting to reorganize, perhaps a counterpush forming, but the gap remained open. The Japanese were no longer chanting. They were breathing hard, moving in staggered bursts, driven by officers who themselves seemed to understand this was final. Holton fired until his rifle clicked empty again. No ammunition left in the crate. He scanned quickly and spotted a fallen Browning automatic rifle near the body of a Marine who had been overrun earlier in the charge. The weapon was half buried in sand and blood. He lunged for it, slid back into the depression, and cleared the chamber in one practiced motion. The weight of it felt heavier than his own rifle, but the familiarity was enough. He braced it against the coral edge and fired in sustained bursts into the densest cluster forming for what looked like the final rush. The bar bucked violently, but the effect was immediate. The front rank dropped almost simultaneously. The men behind them hesitated, not retreating, but faltering in that half-second where instinct collides with inevitability. Holton stood fully upright then, exposed from the waist up, and kept firing. Later accounts would say he appeared almost detached, as if operating within a narrowed frame of reference where survival was no longer the objective, containment was. He shifted targets continuously, denying any one point the chance to build mass. Bodies accumulated at the base of the depression. The slope became difficult to climb not because of fire but because of the fallen. A final grenade landed short, rolled back down toward the attackers. Its detonation broke what cohesion remained. Several Japanese soldiers turned, some wounded, some simply disoriented. Others collapsed where they stood. The momentum that had carried nearly 300 men uphill in a single surge finally fractured under concentrated resistance and mounting loss. Holton's bar emptied with a final metallic snap. He remained standing for a moment, scanning through smoke and flare light for movement. None advanced. The valley that had roared less than 15 minutes earlier now echoed with scattered shots and the low sounds of the wounded. Reinforcements from Company K reached the saddle behind him seconds later, establishing a reinforced perimeter where only moments earlier there had been none. Holton lowered the empty weapon. His left arm trembled uncontrollably now, blood soaking through the sleeve. His throat burned where fingers had tightened around it. He did not sit. He did not collapse. He turned and began helping reposition ammunition and bodies to fortify the depression he had held alone. The first light of dawn crested the horizon as medics finally reached him. When they asked how long he had been isolated forward of the line, he did not answer. He only reached into his jacket, removed the folded letter he had written less than an hour before the charge began, and handed it to Corporal Vance. "Mail it anyway," he said quietly. Behind him, the slope of coral and cane bore the imprint of what had broken there. Not just a charge of 300 men, but the expectation that momentum alone could overrun will. By full daylight, the ridge no longer resembled a battlefield in motion. It looked like something arrested mid-surge. The bodies lay in arcs and broken lines across the coral slope, frozen where momentum had failed. Smoke hung low in the humid air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood and the bitter tang of burned powder. Engineers moved cautiously through the depression, marking positions, checking for wounded among the fallen. Medics worked in near silence, their canvas bags already half empty. Private James Holton sat against the inner wall of the coral cut, his back straight despite the tremor in his arms. His sleeve had been cut open. Shrapnel had lodged shallowly in the muscle beneath his forearm, and coral fragments were embedded along his cheek and neck. The skin around his throat bore deep bruising in the shape of fingers. He watched the work around him without speaking. No one had yet counted the dead. No one needed to. The number was evident in the density of bodies along the incline he had held. Captain Reeves arrived mid-morning with a field notebook and 2 runners. He stood for several seconds at the base of the depression before climbing up to where Holton remained seated. "How many?" he asked quietly. Holton did not give a number. He gestured toward the slope and said only, "They kept coming." Reeves wrote nothing down at first. He looked outward over the field, over the scattered equipment and the officers' swords still glinting where they had fallen. Word had already spread across the battalion that the northern gap had nearly collapsed and that one man had prevented it. What Reeves understood, standing there in the hard morning light, was that the effect extended beyond terrain. The Japanese counterattack had been intended to fracture the American foothold psychologically as much as physically. A successful breakthrough would have shattered the fragile perimeter and forced a retraction of the forward elements preparing for the inland push toward Oslido airfield. Instead, the line had held. More precisely, it had been held long enough for reinforcement to lock it in place. Within hours, artillery observers began adjusting fire coordinates deeper into the valley. By late afternoon, additional companies were advancing through the corridor that had nearly been lost. Holton was moved to the rear aid station for sutures and extraction of embedded fragments. He remained conscious through the procedure, answering routine questions in clipped phrases. When asked if he had fired the bar intentionally from a standing position under open exposure, he responded, "I couldn't see from lower." The medic recorded that statement word for word. It would later appear in formal documentation as evidence of deliberate and exposed defensive action. Holton did not hear that phrasing. He heard only the distant thud of artillery recalibrating beyond the ridge. By the time night fell again, the American perimeter had advanced several hundred yards past the depression. The corridor behind which engineers and wounded had once clustered was now part of a secured supply lane. Trucks began moving forward before midnight, carrying additional ammunition, rations, and equipment necessary to support the continued drive inland. In the days that followed, the seizure of Oslido airfield accelerated. Within weeks, it would be renamed Isley Field and prepared to receive B-29 bombers capable of reaching the Japanese home islands. That strategic chain, ridge to airfield to bombing corridor, did not originate in one moment. But historians would later trace a measurable hinge to that pre-dawn charge and its collapse against a single point of resistance. Holton remained hospitalized for 6 days. During that time, officers gathered statements from men who had witnessed portions of the defense. Estimates of Japanese casualties varied, but conservative counts placed over 100 dead in the immediate vicinity of the depression, with many more wounded retreating into the valley. The original assault strength had been approximately 300. Fewer than half were accounted for as returning to their staging area. The operational objective, to break the American line at that northern saddle, had failed entirely. When Holton was informed that a recommendation for high decoration was being prepared, he declined comment. He asked instead whether the letter he had handed to Corporal Vance had been mailed. It had. Weeks later, in rural Texas, Mrs. Eleanor Holton would open that envelope and read her son's careful script describing heat, coral dust, and the simple hope of returning home to fix the fence line before autumn. The postscript, added by Corporal Vance in a different hand, would explain only that James was safe and had performed his duty beyond expectation. It would not describe the slope. It would not describe the surge. Those details traveled through official channels instead, through battalion reports, through division summaries, through commendation drafts typed in field headquarters tents and later reviewed in Washington. The citation, when finalized, would emphasize courage under overwhelming numbers, exposed position, and decisive effect on the engagement. It would not include the sound of fingers tightening at his throat or the weight of bodies sliding down coral at his feet. Holton returned to duty before the end of July, his arm bandaged, his movements slightly restricted but steady. By then, the airfield was operational. American bombers were staging for missions that would extend the war into the skies above Tokyo. Each takeoff from Saipan's newly secured runways carried a logistical lineage that included the ridge he had held. He never framed it that way. When asked years later about Saipan, he spoke instead of the humidity, the insects, the color of coral under flare light. He described the letter more often than the charge. The letter, he would say, reminded him what the line behind him represented. Not abstract strategy. Not maps with arrows. People. Engineers setting charges. Medics tending to the wounded. Men asleep in shallow foxholes trusting that the perimeter would remain intact through the night. On July 9, 1944, organized Japanese resistance on Saipan ended. The island was declared secured. The cost was measured in thousands on both sides. Holton stood with the rest of Company K during the quiet flag-raising ceremony near the airfield. His arms still wrapped, his expression unreadable. There was no mention of the depression during that brief ceremony. There was no reference to a single man. The war moved forward, as it always did, folding individual acts into larger currents of movement. Yet among those who had stood that night on the ridge and watched 300 figures surge upward into flare light, the memory did not dissolve. It remained fixed, an imprint in coral and smoke, marking the place where momentum broke against will, and where a letter written in the dark did not become an ending, but a continuation. Recognition came slowly, as it often did in the Pacific. Weeks after Saipan was secured, the paperwork completed its passage through division channels. Statements were collated. Casualty estimates were verified. Maps were annotated to demonstrate the precise location of the northern saddle and the projected line of Japanese advance. The language of the citation hardened into formality. Conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. It described the exposed position, the repeated assaults, the decision to stand and fire when retreat would have been logical. It described the effect, how his resistance prevented envelopment of the battalion flank and enabled consolidation of the perimeter. What it did not describe was the quiet interval beforehand, when he had finished his letter by flare light and folded it with careful hands. Decorations were never designed to record interior moments. They recorded outcomes. Private James Holton was called forward in formation before the company several months later, after reassignment and refitting. The medal was pinned to his chest with ceremony, but the sound that stayed with him was not applause. It was the echo of that pre-dawn surge, the rhythm of boots on coral, the breath of men charging through darkness. He accepted the commendation without embellishment. When asked if he had believed he would survive, he answered simply, "It wasn't the point." Those who heard him understood that what he meant was structural. The point had been to hold long enough for the shape behind him to remain intact. After Saipan came Tinian, then training cycles and redeployments that blurred into the grinding cadence of 1944 and 1945. The war in the Pacific narrowed into air corridors and island chains, into logistics and range calculations that extended toward the Japanese home islands. Holton saw less direct combat in the months that followed, but the war did not recede from him. It lingered in the tremor that sometimes touched his injured arm, in the reflex that caused him to glance toward sudden movement at the edge of his vision. When news reached the unit of the first B-29 raids launched from the Marianas toward Tokyo, men spoke about distance, about the fact that the war had shifted from beaches to cities far beyond their sight. Holton listened without comment. He understood that the ridge on Saipan had been one link in a longer chain. If that northern saddle had collapsed, if the engineers and supply columns had been overrun, the airfield might have been delayed. Delay meant recalibration. Recalibration meant extended war. The hinge had been small in geography but large in consequence. In August 1945, the news arrived that atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended in a manner few had imagined when they first landed on coral beaches. Holton was still in uniform when the surrender was announced. He did not cheer. He did not weep. He stood in the formation and listened as the words were read. 300 men had once charged him under flare light, believing they were breaking a line. Now an empire had surrendered under a different light altogether. The arithmetic of the Pacific War was too vast to reconcile easily. Holton returned to Texas in early 1946. The train carried him through towns that had grown accustomed to absence and were now learning the shape of return. His mother met him at the station in the same dress she had worn the day he left. The letter he had written on Saipan had been folded and refolded so many times that its creases were white with wear. She did not ask about the medal immediately. She asked whether he had eaten properly on the voyage home. She asked whether his arm still hurt. Only later, when neighbors gathered and the local paper requested a photograph, did the story circulate in fragments. 300 Japanese soldiers, a ridge held alone, a medal for gallantry. Holton did not correct the numbers when they inflated in retelling. He did not amplify them either. He returned to repairing fences and tending cattle. The rhythm of civilian life replaced the rhythm of artillery. But some nights, especially when wind moved across the fields in a certain way, he found himself standing still, listening for movement beyond the edge of darkness. He married in 1949. He worked, raised children, paid taxes, and attended church. The medal remained in a drawer for most of his life. When asked about Saipan decades later by a visiting schoolteacher compiling oral histories, he described the coral first. "It cuts through boots," he said. "It stays in your skin." He described the flare light and the way it made shadows move faster than men. Only at the end of the interview did he mention the letter. "I thought it might be the last one," he admitted. "So I made sure it sounded normal." That word, normal, carried weight. It meant fences, cattle, dry Texas wind. It meant a life not defined solely by a single ridge under fire. Private James Holton died in 1988. The medal was eventually donated to a local museum alongside the letter he had written on June 16, 1944. Visitors who read the letter encounter none of the violence that followed. They read about heat and dust, about hope of return, about simple promises deferred. They stand before the display case and imagine the distance between that quiet handwriting and the pre-dawn surge of 300 men. History records that the Battle of Saipan cost over 3,000 American lives and tens of thousands of Japanese. It records the strategic importance of the island, the opening of air corridors, and the shift of war toward the Japanese mainland. What it cannot record fully is the narrow depression of coral where momentum broke against a single fixed point, and where a letter written in darkness did not become an ending but an anchor. The hinge of that night was not a spectacle. It was a decision, measured in seconds, executed without witness, absorbed later into the vast accounting of war. And in rural Texas, long after the maps had turned and the headlines faded, that hinge remained folded in a letter that had nearly been the last. What happened after that night on Saipan was not cinematic. There were no sudden parades, no triumphant orchestras rising over the coral ridges. The hill was absorbed back into the larger geometry of the campaign, its coordinates inked on operational maps and then replaced by arrows pointing west. Engineers returned to the saddle once it was secure. They reinforced the ridge with sandbags and wire, laid communication lines across the depression where Holton had stood, and extended the defensive grid deeper into the island. The war continued forward in layers. Within weeks, the airstrips on Saipan were operational enough to begin receiving heavy bombers. Within months, B-29 superfortresses were launching toward Tokyo, each mission measured in fuel tonnage and bomb weight rather than the number of rifles defending a ridge. The Pacific War shifted scale. Individual acts became invisible against industrial velocity. Yet the ridge remained part of the equation. If it had broken, the engineers behind it would have scattered, the supply lines feeding the assault would have faltered, and the airfields might have been delayed long enough to change sequencing. War is rarely altered by a single moment, but it is often protected by them. Holton's stand did not win Saipan, prevented loss. And preventing loss in a campaign built on incremental advance is a form of victory seldom acknowledged in headlines. In the months that followed, Holton wrote fewer letters. The cadence of correspondence slowed as the tempo of operations increased. When he did write, he avoided the language of heroism. He wrote about weather, about the monotony between engagements, about the way the ocean looked from the transport deck at dusk. He did not describe the ridge again. He did not describe the flare light or the shape of men charging through coral dust. Memory hardened into private architecture. His arm, scarred by coral fragments and recoil burn, stiffened in damp air. Doctors recommended exercises. He complied. But the stiffness remained, as did the reflex that pulled his shoulders tight when fireworks cracked on summer nights years later. After the war, when Saipan was cited in strategic studies as the turning hinge of the Pacific, Holton rarely corrected anyone who spoke of inevitability. He had seen how fragile inevitability felt at 3 in the morning when ammunition ran low and the dark moved toward you with voices. Inevitable outcomes are assembled from moments that felt anything but assured. He understood that better than most. In Texas, the land did not ask about inevitability. It asked about fences, about cattle feed, about rainfall patterns and drought cycles. Holton returned to those measures. He married in 1948. The farm expanded slowly, acre by acre, each boundary line staked with the same patience he had once applied to holding a ridge. Neighbors sometimes brought visitors who wanted to hear about the 300. Holton would listen to the retelling and nod politely. If pressed, he would say the number did not matter as much as the direction. They were coming from there, he would gesture. And we were here. He did not dramatize the space between those points. He simply marked it. The medal remained in its drawer, wrapped in a handkerchief. His children found it once when searching for spare batteries. They asked what it meant. He told them it meant he had done his job when it counted. He did not elaborate. In 1974, a historian from a university in Austin contacted him while compiling oral testimonies from veterans of the Marianas Campaign. Holton agreed to speak on the condition that the letter be included in the archive. "The letter is the honest part," he said. "The rest is noise." The historian recorded him in a small living room, ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. Holton described the coral first, the way it cut through boots, the way it held the heat of the day long after sunset. He described the flare light and how it erased depth perception. He described fear without dramatizing it. "You don't think about dying," he said. "You think about holding long enough so the men behind you don't have to run." When asked whether he had believed he would survive, he paused. "Belief wasn't relevant," he replied. "Time was. That distinction mattered. The ridge had been a measure of time, not courage. A narrowing corridor through which events passed." In August 1988, Holton died quietly in a hospital 20 miles from the farm where he had lived most of his life. The obituary mentioned his service, the medal, the Battle of Saipan. It did not mention the flare light or the letter. His children later donated both to a regional museum dedicated to World War II veterans. The display case contains the folded paper, now yellowed at the creases, and a small placard summarizing the event in careful language. Visitors read about 300 Japanese soldiers halted by a single Marine. They read about a ridge held at dawn. What they cannot read is the texture of that hour, the way coral dust hangs in the throat, the way breath shortens under recoil, the way the horizon blurs under magnesium light. They cannot read the calculation made in the space between a letter folded and a rifle raised. But they sense something in the restraint of the writing. The letter does not anticipate heroism. It anticipates absence. And in that anticipation lies the hinge. Saipan became a stepping stone toward Tokyo. The B-29s launched, the Pacific tightened, and the war ended in fire over cities far beyond that coral ridge. History remembers the scale of those endings. It rarely remembers the narrow saddle where momentum nearly broke. Private James Holton did not consider himself the reason the war moved westward. He considered himself a man who refused to step aside when stepping aside would have unstitched the line. The difference is quiet, almost invisible. But wars are often preserved by those quiet differences. On a humid night in June 1944, under flare light that made shadows run faster than men, a letter lay folded in a breast pocket while 300 voices advanced through coral dust. The letter survived. So did the ridge. And somewhere between those two survivals, history tilted just enough to continue forward. There is a tendency, when looking back at the Pacific War from a distance of decades, to smooth it into inevitability. Arrows on maps, island chains falling in sequence, airfields carved from coral and converted into launch platforms for bombers bound toward Japan. Saipan becomes a strategic milestone. The Marianas become a hinge. The mathematics of industrial war take over the narrative. But if you narrow the frame, if you compress the lens to one ridge at 3 in the morning, inevitability dissolves into breath and bone and heat. The Battle of Saipan was not a clean pivot in June 1944. It was confusion layered over exhaustion, coral dust clogging lungs, artillery concussion rattling thought. It was men measuring time in seconds and magazines, not in campaign phases. Private James Holton's stand did not rewrite the Pacific War in a single stroke. It did something quieter, prevented a break. It held a seam. It bought continuity. And continuity is what allowed the larger machine to keep turning. The regiment did not fold inward under a rear assault. The ridge remained in American hands long enough for daylight to expose the cost of the night. That is how wars are preserved, not by grand gestures alone, but by moments when someone refuses to let the geometry collapse. Holton did not know that B-29 bombers would soon lift off from the runways carved out of Saipan's plateau, flying toward Tokyo with payloads that would redefine the war's scale. He did not know that historians would later describe the Marianas as the gateway to the Japanese home islands. He knew only the direction from which the attack was coming and the men who stood behind him with fewer rounds than they wanted. He understood something fundamental. If that narrow saddle fell, the cost would multiply outward. So he remained. After the war, analysts would calculate tonnage dropped, sorties flown, factories destroyed. They would write about supply superiority, about the strategic strangulation of Japan's capacity to resist. Rarely do those analyses pause on the small fulcrums that allowed the machine to remain intact. The ridge on Saipan was one such fulcrum, not because it was dramatic, though it was, but because it was decisive in a way that never appears on a map. It was decisive in the negative sense. Prevented loss, kept something from unraveling. Historians are trained to identify breakthroughs. They are less equipped to catalog the absences, the disasters that did not happen because one position did not break. Holton never tried to reshape the memory. He never inflated the number, never corrected the storytellers who exaggerated the scale of the attack. In interviews late in his life, when pressed about the 300, he would lean back slightly and say, "It was enough." That was his measure. Not the precise count, not the mythology, but the weight of the force pressing against the line. Enough to break it. Enough to justify staying. Enough to ensure that if he stepped aside, the cost would be paid by someone else first. His restraint in describing it may be the most revealing detail of all. The men who shout about their heroism rarely understand its weight. The ones who lower their voices usually do. The letter he wrote before the attack remains the clearest window into the night. It was not prophetic. It did not predict glory. It simply acknowledged possibility, the possibility of absence, of silence, of not returning to the wide Texas sky he described with such understated affection. That letter was written in the thin air between fatigue and resolve. It captured the mental terrain before the physical one erupted. And that is perhaps the true measure of his courage. He did not wait for certainty. He did not require belief in survival. He folded the paper, placed it in his pocket, and stepped toward the place where continuity might fail. The Pacific War closed in layers. After Saipan came Tinian, then Guam, then the long advance through the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island became another rung on the ladder toward Japan. The B-29s that launched from the Marianas altered the war's trajectory, shortening distances that once seemed insurmountable. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the maps were redrawn again, arrows replaced with occupation zones. Somewhere in the vast accounting of victory, the ridge on Saipan dissolved into summary. It became a line item in regimental reports, a footnote in campaign histories. But the men who stood there did not dissolve. They carried it forward in posture and in silence. Private James Holton returned to Texas with a scar across his arm and a stiffness in his shoulder that lingered in damp weather. He built fences and mended gates. He planted and harvested. He measured seasons instead of ammunition. And when he stood at the edge of his land at dusk, looking west, there were moments when the color of the sky reminded him of flare light over coral. He did not speak of it often. He did not need to. The ridge had already done what it needed to do. History remembers wars through capitals and treaties. It remembers them through generals and conferences. But wars are also remembered or forgotten, through letters folded in pockets and ridges held long enough for dawn. The siege of Saipan was not decided by one Marine. Yet, on a humid night in June 1944, the continuity of an assault rested for a moment on a narrow saddle and a man who refused to step aside. He did not outlive the war by accident. He outlasted a single hour that could have broken everything behind him. In the end, that is what the letter proves. Not that he was fearless. Not that he was certain. But he understood the weight of a hinge. The hinge does not shout when it holds. simply turns the door and allows history to pass through. And on Saipan, under a sky fractured by magnesium light, the hinge held.